So Dennis over at the Analog Archives YouTube channel has reached 2,000 subscribers. And in recognition of that, he's asked us in the metal community to come up with at least 10 sophomore albums that are as good as, if not better than, the debut. So I'll be picking second release records from my metal vinyl collection that I feel are at least a little better than the first. And I'll probably talk about why as well. Stay tuned. So some of you might be familiar with what's known as the sophomore slump, or sophomore jinx, if you will. It pertains to bands having to follow up a relatively successful first album with one that's either just as good, if not even better. And that's not an easy feat. Material on those first albums was often the result of many years of writing and revision, whereas the second record had to be written in a much more restrictive time frame, often only a year. Of course, some bands resort to padding out album number 2 with unused demo songs, but others simply have to create an entire album from scratch and with limited time. So again, really tough to do. But I'm going to say that the 10 albums I'm chatting about today have beaten that curse. And just to keep it fair, the one restriction I'm placing on myself is that I'm only doing full-length studio albums. So no EPs, no live albums, no compilations. I also tried to pick albums that I didn't see a lot of people, if any, talk about in their own response videos. So there will likely be maybe a few surprises in here for you. Anyways, let's get to some killer second records. First up is the second studio album from British heavy rock band Motorhead. This is Overkill, released in 1979 by Bronze Records. So while there are a couple decent tracks on that self-titled debut of theirs, it's also fairly primitive and somewhat steeped in old-timey rock and roll, like 50s rock and roll. And with few exceptions, it has no real punch to it. As for Overkill, right away from that opening title track, you get speed and grit and actual heaviness, plus overall much more what Motorhead would be known for from this album on. Even Fast Eddie Clarke is better utilized here, and Phil Taylor's drumming is noticeably ramped up from the debut. Given that, my favorites are Overkill, Stay Clean, Tear You Down, and Metropolis. So definitely better than the first album. Next is the second studio album from American speed metal band Abattar. This is The Only Safe Place, released in 1986 by Combat Records. So I'm sure there are folks who prefer Abattoir's debut album, Vicious Attack, just a little bit more. It's certainly thrashier and more raw, but it's also their fistful of metal, whereas The Only Safe Place is more or less their spreading the disease. Now I like both, but it's hard to deny the improvements here. Production is better, musicianship has improved, and the replacement vocalist is a qualitatively better singer. Again, to make the Anthrax comparison, he's a Joey when the first guy is a Neil. And I feel Abattoir really benefits from the singer change, but the songwriting also falls in line with that. Anyways, favorites on this one are Bring on the Damned, Hammer of the Gods, and Back to Hell. So both albums are great, but this one is just a little bit better. Next up is the second studio album from Danish metal band Merciful Fate. This is Don't Break the Oath, released in 1984 by Roadrunner Records. So for some folks, the first two Merciful Fate albums might be tough to compare. Both are utter classics, both have a killer guitar duo in Sherman and Denner, and both are sufficiently evil and creepy. But for my money, Don't Break the Oath inches by its predecessor due to its overall musical variety, its slightly more complex songwriting, the insanely cool guitar tone, and even King's vocals are more compelling and improved here. Not to diminish Melissa at all, because that's a killer record in its own right. But Don't Break the Oath really is an undeniable next step up from the debut. As for favorites, they are A Dangerous Meeting, Desecration of Souls, and The Oath. So although I love both albums, the second record is just that much better. Next is the second studio album from American speed metal band Agent Steel. This is Unstoppable Force, released in 1987 by Combat Records. So a slightly improved production on this one, but aside from that, it's really splitting hairs when pitting Unstoppable Force against their first album, Skeptic's Apocalypse. Because they really go well together, kind of like Screaming and Defenders for Judas Priest. But put a gun to my head and told to pick one, it's gonna be Unstoppable Force. Also digging this band's speed metal style blending with a clear Queensryche influence, noticeably in the vocals, but on this record it also seems to bleed into the instrumentation. Anyways, favorites on this one are Unstoppable Force, Rager, and The Day at Guyana. So it's almost too hard to choose, but this one barely squeaks by the first album. But again, splitting hairs. Next up is the second studio album from Canadian metal band Anvil. This is Metal on Metal, released in 1982 by Attic Records. So this one is a bit of a no-brainer, as it's no secret that Anvil's first album, Hard and Heavy, is a rather generic rock album with its roots in the 70s. It wouldn't be until this second album that they'd go more of a metal route, yay, a speed metal route, and in fact influence a ton of bands to that effect. Even playing the first two albums back-to-back, it sounds like two totally different bands. And with a massive increase in heaviness, crunching riffs, and vocal aggression, Metal on Metal is an insane improvement. Though to be fair, it has a little bit of filler on it as well. Favorites on this one are Metal on Metal, Mothra, and 666. So hands down, far superior to the debut, and obviously so. Next is the second studio album from American power speed metal band Liegelord. This is Burn to My Touch, released in 1987 by Combat Records. So this one's going to be a matter of personal taste since the two albums are both good, but I side more with the second record mainly for the cleaner production, the improved delivery and range of their vocalist, and for occasionally stepping outside of the more predictable speed and thrash of the debut. Both albums are worth hearing and owning, but Burn to My Touch is more of a go-to Liegelord album for me. So there's that. Anyways, my favorites are Transgressor, Birds of Prey, and Cast Out. So you really can't go wrong with the first three Liegelord albums in general, but this second album overall does it for me more often than not. Next is the second studio album from Swedish neoclassical guitarist Inve J Momin. This is Marching Out, released in 1985 by Polydor Records. And by the way, US album cover. Europe's looks a little different. Anyways, right away, both albums are great, but I often lean a little bit more towards Marching Out, mainly because we get to hear a lot more of vocalist Jeff Scott Soto, since he only sings on 2 of 8 tracks on the debut. On Marching Out, Soto's on 8 out of 11, and that's not only more Soto, but with the bigger song count, it's also more Yngwie too. Songwriting is also catchier and not simply neoclassical shredding, which the debut concentrates on a whole lot more. Granted, I dig both albums, but Marching Out has a bit more of a draw for me. Anyways, favorites on this one are I'll See the Light Tonight, Disciples of Hell, and I Am a Viking. So though I like the first album, I'm glad Malmsteen chose to have more vocals and catchier songwriting on this one. So Marching Out definitely wins. Next is the second studio album from American power speed metal band Hellstar. This is Remnants of War, released in 1986 by Combat Records. So there's little denying that Hellstar's debut album Burning Star has its strengths, but it's on Remnants of War where the band gets considerably heavier and the vocals have better range and power. As with some of the other records mentioned before, this too has an improved production though, just enough to add to the sound and without taking the bite out of the material. Speaking of that material, my favorites here are Evil Reign, Dark Queen, and Fear the Wicked One. So both albums are worth the spin, but for me, Remnants of War is the slightly better of the two. Next up is the second studio album from American heavy metal band Malice. This is License to Kill, released in 1987 by Atlantic Records. So while Malice's debut record In the Beginning had some good tracks on it, it was also held back a bit by a few of the LA metal cliches, which they seem to have somewhat shaken off for this album. But to be fair, somewhat. When you compare the two, License to Kill is catchier and definitely heavier, especially once you get to track 3. Also, a sharp improvement on the riffs throughout. As for favorites, they are Against the Empire, Chain Gang Woman, and Breathing Down Your Neck. So while Malice always sat firmly between trad metal and first wave hair metal, this is certainly the better of the first 2 records. If you're looking for a starting point with this band, you do well to start with License to Kill. Next is the second studio album from American power metal band Tyrant. This is Too Late to Pray, released in 1987 by Combat Records. Whole lot of combat here today. Anyways, Tyrant's first album, Legions of the Dead, is certainly a decent US power metal album with some speed metal leanings, but it really is the second album that is not only heavier, but certainly darker as well. I mean, you still get some of the speed of the debut, but now more of an epic feel here than the last, not to mention more consistency. Vocals are also a bit more ambitious than the debut. And sure, they both lack some proper production, but that's also true for a lot of indie metal releases at the time. As for favorites on this one, check out Too Late to Pray, Bells of Hades, and especially Eve of Destruction. So when it really comes down to it, both albums are largely comparable, but Too Late to Pray definitely has a darker and more epic edge to it that brings it at least a little higher than the first album. Check it out. So again, I tried to pick albums that others wouldn't, but I'm sure an album or two overlapped with someone. I was definitely shocked not to see Anvil in a lot of those response videos out there because it's such a dramatic example of this, likely one of the biggest in metal. To a lesser extent, I was also expecting Motorhead to pop up a bit, but not so much. In either case, I think we all had a fun time doing this, and really, that's what matters. You know that, I know that. And this is probably a good time to ask what you thought of my choices, or if you have your own picks for second albums better than the first. Let me know your thoughts on all of that in the comments below. Of course, much thanks to Dennis for starting this thread, and congrats to him for reaching 2,000 subs. And although the deadline for his contest is likely passed, you should go over to the Analog Archives channel anyways and give him a sub. Check out his videos, all of that, especially if you love classic extreme metal, as he covers that a whole lot. Good dude, good channel. As for my channel and the guy running it, my name is Matt, and this is the Accusation Network, where each and every week I do videos on metal vinyl collecting. I also cover the subjects of classic and modern metal in general. If you dig the sound of that, give this video a like, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and share my videos with some of your friends. And of course, thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.